This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. David Schemm, Kansas Farm Service Agency State Executive Director, starts off the show chatting about reporting producers can get done in the offices and what programs are available for drought and disasters. K-State Cow-Calf Extension Specialist Jason Warner continues today's show as he explains the important factors of mineral for cattle and what sometimes gets forgotten by producers. Ending the show is part of the Beef Cattle Institute's Cattle Chat podcast with Brad White, Bob Larson, Dustin Pendell, and Phillip Lancaster discussing risk management options for cattle producers. That and more is coming up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Wednesday show with an update from Kansas Farm Service Agency from the State Executive Director of the Kansas Farm Service Agency, David Schemm. David, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Shelby. Good to be here, and always a springtime of the year. It's one of my favorite seasons of the year.
David, as we're talking right now, what deadline is coming up in just a couple of days?
Shelby, I know we've mentioned it before here, but grassland CRP. So, those producers out there that have pasture or grassland on their operation, and they're interested in possibly enrolling it in the grassland CRP, that deadline is coming up here, the end of May here. So they have just a short amount of time if they're interested in that to swing by the county office there. Just a brief overview for it, Shelby. Especially like guys that have pasture or rangeland out there that think they might be interested in it. They kind of go sign up there for it. A grazing plan is developed for those acres, kind of targeting, how many livestock and grazing season out there that they can run. And, the concept is to make sure that we're preserving the natural habitat and grass out there and helping that there. So, those programs, if they think that program producers think they'll work with it or interested in it, definitely get into the county offices and see if it works for them. And that sign up ends here at the end of this week.
And while we're thinking about our producers, base acres, what updates do you have when it comes to those?
So a big thing that we've been working on, Shelby, again, as was passed in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, or OBA, as a lot of people have referred to, is that 30 million base acre update for our row crop producers out there to be able to add additional acres based upon their planted history in 2019 through 2023. So that period there of those years, again, it averages those 5 years there and allow producers to possibly add additional base acres onto what their current acres are. Again, Shelby, that relates into the ARC and PLC program that producers are automatically signed up for receiving the higher of for 2025. Again, remember, I know we're 2026, but those ARC PLC payments are based upon the 2025 year there. So coming up here in just a few days, June 1st there, producers will be able to start to look at their acres. Neat thing about it, again, encourage producers out there utilizing Farmers.gov. That'll give you a link over into login.gov or login.gov. Producers, if they get signed up for that there, they'll be able to start to access into that on their operation and see what their possible base acres are update here just in the next week or so, Shelby. And that login.gov will give those producers the ability to look at what their possible acre update will be, again, starting after June 1.
And while we're thinking about acres, do we need to make sure producers are going in to report what they're getting planted?
Oh, absolutely, Shelby. I'm so glad you mentioned that there. A very, very busy time of the year. So, I know many of our office staff have that farm roots background, and they know what harvest season is like for the producers out there, whether it's wheat harvest or fall harvest. Just a really busy time on operations there. With July 15th is kind of that harvest season for our county offices out there, as all of the producers there report their acreage. Really strongly encourage producers, hey, if you've finished up planting crops this year or finished up planting your corn or your soybeans, go ahead and get into that county office there, report those acres there. The closer you get to that July 15th deadline, the busier our offices get. And sometimes you may not be able to just walk in there. You may have to get an appointment because the office may be so busy. So again, as producers are wrapping up those planted acres this year, definitely strongly encourage them to get into the county office. Again, that acreage reporting is kind of that key thing for so many of our programs. Again, as producers know, whether it's a farmer bridge assistance that was based upon planted acres, or even as I referenced this base acre update, we look at that acreage reporting from 2019 through 2023. The sooner the producer does it, the more fresh in that memory it is for when he planted that or what fields he planted.
And what crops should producers be reporting their acres on?
So again, that's going to be all of your spring planted crops as well as your grass acres. Again, in the fall, it's for that winter acres there, like the winter wheat there is when we report those acres there. So this again is going to be all of those spring planted crops as well as grass crops, everything like that as we start this year and this season there. So come in, have those planting dates, have those fields fresh in your mind, know which fields were planted to what, and you can report that there. And that creates what we call that 578, that acreage reporting form that is one of the key things for FSA.
And going a little bit away from maybe more of the crops and heading over to the livestock programs with the Farm Service Agency, one unfortunately that's getting more use, livestock forage program. And can you remind us, what is this program?
Absolutely, Shelby. That's one thing. I think last year there were several times during the year where that drought monitor map had Kansas almost in no drought. Unfortunately, this year we are just looking at drought again in various areas of the state here. I know as a producer, I watch that forecast very closely. In fact, I watch it across the state there just to see who might be getting rain. And Shelby, unfortunately, it seems like we've got spots almost all around the state that have been missing some rain. Livestock forage program, again, compensates producers for that loss of forage for the livestock out there based upon, the number of livestock they had. The trigger points for livestock forage program is the drought monitor map. So if the county that you've got those livestock in is in a D2 level drought for 4 weeks, that triggers the livestock forage program, or anytime it hits into a D3 or greater level there, that automatically triggers a payment on the livestock forage program there. So, when producers, if they think they're getting close to that or they have questions, our county offices do a great job in tracking that there. Get in, talk to that county office there. They can help you. Again, it's one of those things, encourage that you've got that inventory numbers a little bit more fresh in your mind from turning those cows out or the livestock out on that pasture. You'll know what that inventory count is. It's going to help you when the county asks you what your livestock numbers were and reporting that. So definitely encourage producers to get in there sooner than later to report the number of livestock and ask about the program there. So, unfortunately, Shelby, we already have 23 counties in the state that have qualified for livestock forage program. And I know the knee-jerk reaction is going to be, well, that's all out there in western Kansas. Well, absolutely, the majority of them are out there, but we actually have it scattered across the state in south central, north central, and even southeast. Labette County has triggered for LFP in southeast Kansas there. The one exception I will say has been northeast Kansas thus far. We haven't had any counties qualify, but, again, closely monitoring that drought monitor map and crossing fingers and toes that these chances of rain will absolutely cover the state.
Unfortunately, we have had some more wildfires in western Kansas in these past few weeks. And so, what programs might producers be able to use that are associated with the Farm Service Agency?
Shelby, like I said earlier, keep watching those rain clouds there and hoping and praying that we get the rain across the state there, especially in those areas down there, Meade County, Clark, all those areas that have been unfortunately devastated by wildfires coming through there. And I know that they need the rain there, help to bring on that spring grass, control those fires, everything like that. So we had a couple of fires come through there, obviously devastating some of our producers down there. Programs I want to mention that they definitely want to have on their radar: Emergency Conservation Program, or ECP, our Livestock Indemnity Program, or LIP, and then our Emergency Livestock Assistance Program, or ELAP. Just a brief overview there. ECP, Emergency Conservation Program, is a little bit more designed for rebuilding a fence there. So helps those producers rebuild the fence, can also affect waters, rebuilding waters, various things like that. That's just a broad general overview for ECP. ELAP, Emergency Livestock Assistance Program, can help producers with the transportation of water or forage, hay for those producers there. So there's assistance there on that. And of course, the Livestock Indemnity Program, and that's for when the livestock have either been killed or severely injured by the fires, can help indemnify those producers for that. So those three programs are key, kind of that fencing, water, or transportation, or the loss of livestock there. Programs are some of our key programs helping those producers with the wildfires. So for those producers that have been affected by those wildfires, definitely talk with the local office there. One thing I definitely want to mention there is if those producers are needing areas to go because of the loss of the pasture there, we do have waivers in place there that producers can actually get out there and fence off some CRP and allow their cattle to go out on CRP. Unfortunately, one of the things for it right now, we are in what we call the primary nesting season. So they do have access and can graze that CRP. It's at that 50% level, unfortunately. But again, remember that they can access any of that CRP. It doesn't have to be just their own CRP, but it can be a neighbor's CRP there, and obviously no cost to them. So make sure that we note that we have those tools available to try to help our producers.
David, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Shelby, always a joy to talk with you. Thank you.
That was State Executive Director of the Kansas Farm Service Agency, David Schemm. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show discussing mineral reminders for cattle producers with K-State Cow-Calf Extension Specialist Jason Warner. Jason, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Shelby. Appreciate the opportunity as always.
Jason, as we're thinking about mineral for cattle, what are some big picture things for producers to keep in mind this time of year?
Absolutely. I think this is a really great time to always reconsider your mineral supplementation program that you have for your cow herd going into this later spring, early summer grazing season. And mineral supplementation is certainly important. It's a very important component of the overall nutritional plan that we think about and that we want to make sure that we have lined out for our cow herds. But really, I think when we get into the early summer grazing season, that's when I think it's very much at the forefront of the minds of a lot of producers around the country, because we're getting cattle turned out to grass. We're doing our typical late spring, early summer management activities, and getting mineral in front of cattle as we start the summer grazing season is one that it's an important consideration, and people are usually thinking a lot about it this time of year and making those product selection decisions. And so one of the first things that I think is important to consider and just always keep in mind is that you want to make sure that with whichever feed supplier that you're working with, your product supplier that you choose to work with, make sure that you have that conversation with that provider, well in advance of when you're actually going to be needing that product and getting that product lined up. So that way you have a good understanding of the type of products that they can offer and the products that are the best fit for your operation based on the stage and the production cycle of your cow herd. We know that our manufacturers can put together a wide variety of formulations and trace mineral and macro mineral packages. And we want to keep in mind that it's not always a one-size-fits-all type of an approach. And I think understanding the product that your feed service provider will have available for you, making sure that it's a good fit, looking at options and thinking about, making sure that you've got that product put together that's going to be a good fit for you. And doing that just well in advance of the season is going to be really important, and making sure that they're going to have the product available for you at the time when you need it. Really, one of the last things that we want folks to do is to go to a supplier in a last minute kind of a format and grab a product that may not be the right fit for their cow herd. Potentially it's a product that may not supply the right amount of trace minerals and vitamins for them, and macro minerals as well too. On the flip side of it, you can think about those situations where maybe a producer purchases a product that's maybe over formulated in some situations and may cost that producer more than what they need for that specific situation. And so all this is to be said with the idea that we want to make sure that we're understanding the product that's appropriate for the time of the season, and making sure that we have a good understanding of what that product is intended to be used for, and doing so helps us manage our cost on our mineral supplementation program, and that's really important. And we think about our production cost today. We know that we can easily have maybe $900 to $1,000 per cow in an annual production budget when we think about our total annual cow cost for carrying that animal throughout the year. And I think in a lot of situations, we can put together a good, effective mineral supplementation program with today's cost that might be $60 per cow or less when we think about what our consumption should be. And so it's certainly an important component of the overall nutritional plan for the cow herd, but certainly we want to make sure that we're approaching it in the right manner.
Jason, you're talking about mineral formulations, and what are some factors within that can contribute to what cattle are willing to consume, but also making sure they get enough?
We know that we see a tremendous amount of variation in our herd consumption as a group, and then on an individual animal basis, from one pasture to the next, one operation to the next. And I know our producers see that, and sometimes that can be kind of challenging when we look at a specific herd or a group of cows, and maybe our consumption is low for that specific group, or maybe it's really high, and we see those changes from one pasture to the next. It can be difficult to figure out. One thing that I really encourage producers to make sure they're doing a good job of is recording and tracking what that consumption is on a pasture, on a group basis throughout the season. And that way, if you've got a record of it, when you get to the end of the grazing season, if you've got a good record of how much mineral those cows actually consumed, and you can go back and look at that, that is really helpful when you think about having that conversation with that service provider or that nutritionist later on into the year, or thinking on into next year. Understanding what your average consumption was can help in those conversations when the conversation is centered around, well, do we need to change our formulation? Do we need to change our product? Well, if we don't know what our consumption was during that last feeding season, if we don't have a good record of that, sometimes those conversations can be a little bit difficult to navigate, right? And so we want to make sure that we're doing a good job of tracking that. The other side of it is certainly we think about just cost, right? If you think about, if you've got mineral, if it costs $28 per bag or $11.20 per ton on a ton basis, if we think about on average for 180-day grazing season, if our consumption is supposed to be 4 ounces per head per day of that product, that's $25 per cow for that feeding period. Well, if our consumption is twice that now, if all of a sudden now those cows are eating 8 ounces per head per day and they're only supposed to be eating 4, if that's the way the product is intended to be formulated for, well, all of a sudden now our cost doubles, right? Our cost during that feeding period goes from $25 to $50 per cow. And so just making sure that we're doing a good job of tracking that and making a good record of what that consumption is really important. There's a lot of things that can affect consumption. When we think about the big things, really salt, phosphorus levels, and then the carrier or the base ingredient that's going to be in that mineral product is certainly something that will affect and drive our consumption. And I think a couple of things that are also important to keep in mind is that make sure that you understand the feeding rate for that product. Sometimes we'll have products that might be formulated for a 2-ounce consumption. Sometimes we might have products that might be formulated for 4 or 7 or 4 or 6 or 8. It really just depends on the specific formulation there and what that product is intended to be used for. But again, you want to make sure that you read the label, follow the label directions, and do a good job of tracking that throughout the year. I think some things that are important to keep in mind Making sure that mineral is protected from the elements is a good thing to do. Sometimes we'll see situations where folks will put that mineral out there in an open top trough or feeder, and it may not be protected from the elements. And we see situations when we get a rain event or a weather event on that product, and sometimes that can cause that product to cake up or bridge up, especially if it's got a high amount of carrier in it. And so, we know that those types of weather events can be negative from a consumption standpoint because they can change the palatability of that product. So we want to make sure that we're keeping that product fresh, trying to protect that product as much as we can. I also think it's important for folks when they get that mineral and delivered into their operation, when they've got it at home, make sure you're doing a good job of storing that product, keeping it out of the sunlight, keeping it up directly off the ground if you can. Making sure that you're protecting it from the weather and certainly from avoiding any moisture getting onto that product during storage, making sure that we're doing a good job of storing it in a clean, dry location. Lots of times those things can be easily overlooked in the day-to-day, but they're really important to make sure that we protect that product that we've spent the money on and that we do a good job of managing the feed out on it.
Do you have any concerns for those cattle who are maybe over-consuming mineral?
Yeah, absolutely. Aside from the cost standpoint, we can certainly run into, or we run a greater risk of running into specifically trace mineral toxicity issues when we start to see those things. And so really that becomes a problem if we have chronic overconsumption over a very extended period of time, right? That's when we would run the greater risk of that. One thing we want to keep in mind is that trace mineral nutrition is really difficult to really understand, and it's very much dependent on the level of trace minerals that are presented in the soil, and then ultimately that are taken up into the grasses and into the forage material that those cattle are consuming. So we know that it varies tremendously across landscapes due to soil type and due to the species compositions that we have present in pastures. But when we have chronic overconsumption and we see that on a continual basis, and we have animals that are eating on a herd basis, on average, if they're eating 3 or 4 times what the product is intended to be fed for, and they're doing that for a very long period of time, that's when we want to come back and rethink what we're doing, maybe rethink how we're managing that product to try to avoid that. The other thing, too, that we just always want to keep in mind is if that product is formulated with a medicated feed additive, overconsumption is something that we want to avoid, and so we want to make sure that we're targeting that consumption. So we're staying on label there as much as we can if that product is medicated.
Jason, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Shelby, appreciate it as always.
That was K-State Cow-Calf Extension Specialist Jason Warner. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show with part of the Beef Cattle Institute's Cattle Chat podcast with Brad White, Bob Larson, Dustin Pendell, and Phillip Lancaster as they discuss risk management tools for cattle.
There has been some research that I've seen. It's been years ago, but livestock, we'll call livestock versus crops. Well, crop producers tend to use a lot more futures contracts, stuff like that. And you're right, cow-calf producers in particular, I don't think tend to use these kinds of options. Part of it is knowledge. I mean, it's especially if you think futures and options. Fees.
It's a little complicated.
It's complicated. You got broker fees, you got margin calls, things like that. So that's another. But more recently, and more recently, I mean, the last, 5-10 years, there's been like USDA's introduced some insurance products. And so the insurance products maybe a little easier. And it's also, I think, like the LRP, you can do one head if you want.
It's down to the per head. Whereas
the futures contract, if I recall correctly, it's like 50,000-pound contracts. And so that also is another reason the size of the operation can be another. But basically what you're trying to do, like you said, you're trying to lock in some kind of floor price is what you're trying to do. And yes, if prices go up, you might be missing out on some of that, but it goes back to you're trying to reduce the price rate. You're trying to reduce the markets go against you. And that's why you kind of you got to know what your break-even price is so you can kind of lock in that price.
When you're saying price risk, you're saying price variability. right? So I'm more certain that I'm going to get this price. I'm not going to get the upside. I'm not going to get the downside.
Correct.
So I can predict.
So backtrack just a little bit between like grain and livestock, because you talked about the size of the contract matters. We don't have very many cow-calf operations that can meet or match a 50,000-pound feeder calf contract. But also the feeder calf contract specifies like 7 to 8 weight cattle and things like that, where I'm weaning a 500-pound calf. So somehow I've got to be able to make a math adjustment there. Whereas from a grain perspective, yellow corn is yellow corn, and so there's that price slide on the cattle side is, again, another factor you got to make an adjustment for that you don't have on the grain side.
And sometimes hard to predict the price slide. And then sometimes people talk about the basis. Dustin, what does that mean?
So basis, when you think about futures and options, it all comes back to basis, right? And basis is just the difference. It's a cash price minus the futures price. So your cash is going to be your local. So that could be, let's say, Manhattan, Kansas. Futures price is going to be out of Chicago. And so you've got that difference in those two prices. And that's what, you got to know what your basis is. You got to try to know what your expected basis is going to be when you're trying to enter into these futures contracts.
Well, it sounds like that's one of the reasons, Bob, is you kind of have to predict the basis, then you have to predict the price slide, and then I have to have enough if I'm going to do a futures contract. But some of the insurance policies or the livestock risk protection or program, that could be an option.
Oh, no, it absolutely is an option. And again, coming back to futures contracts, right, you got margin calls, and if it's working against you, you could be getting a margin call frequently. Whereas if you maybe participate in insurance, like an LRP, which is kind of like an options program where you pay a premium, and then if the prices move against you, then you would, exercise that. Otherwise, if prices move for you, then you wouldn't need to use that product.
I hear about more cow-calf producers exploring the risk management insurance just because of some of the simplicity and the size of contracts and things like that. But I also hear, they may not purchase for all of the cattle they intend to sell. And in other words, buy enough to cover half of the herd, something like that. And again, it's all about risk management, risk tolerance, because it does. I have a cost associated with buying some downside risk protection. So do I want to be completely protected from downside risk protection, or I just want to reduce the potential loss less than it would be if prices moved against me?
And I would argue that comes back to each individual producer's got different risk tolerances. Some people might
maybe they
like
have
to
more
gamble.
Cash reserve than others.
You don't know, and that maybe they want to take a little bit of a gamble, and they're willing to not hedge 100%. It's maybe we're only going to hedge half of it.
Yeah.
Once again, that was part of the Beef Cattle Institute's Cattle Chat podcast. That's all we have for you today on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you tomorrow.